Welcome everybody to the third Holloway reading of this semester, of the spring season. I'm Hilary Gravendike. I'm the co-curator of this series along with the faculty curator Charles Altieri. And I'm happy to welcome Joshua Clover and Colin Dingler, our featured poets tonight. I hope you got a chance to enter our raffle too for a free book signed by Joshua Clover. I also want to encourage you all to, as you listen tonight, to formulate interesting, thoughtful, probing questions so that during our Q&A we won't be bored. So think about that. And I also want to make a few announcements about upcoming readings. First off, next week there'll be a reading by the Train Wreck Union, which is a group of students here, represented over here largely, students and alumni and people from all over the place. They have a big web presence, and they are having their reading at Nabalom Bakery next Thursday at 7:30 p.m. That's March 22nd. And one of their members is our own Jack Morgan, who designs our beautiful flyers for the event. So I hope you'll attend. The other is our final reading for the Holloway series this spring. We won't be back until the fall, and that is featuring Jory Graham and graduate student in ethnic studies Jennifer Reimer. And that will be, the date has actually changed, so mark your calendars. It's going to be on a Friday night. You'll have to postpone your party plans till later in the evening, around 9, so you don't have to miss any poetry. So Jory Graham is the 20th of April at 6:30 p.m. with Jen Reimer. And so you can check our website for details, as always. That's holloway.english.berkeley.edu. All the updates are there, the schedule's there. And without further ado, we're going to get right into the poetry. In an unusual but delightful change of pace, we're going to have our featured poet introduce our graduate poet. So welcome, Joshua.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Linguists are rightly vexed over the derivation of the verb to dingle. Only 15 years before the Spanish Armada, it seems to indicate a feeling in the ear. Mine ears ring or dingle, dignant ores. In 1827, the year of the Great Fire of Turku, Finland, the poet Rachel M. Pride used the verb to describe something else. Not an experience, but an external event, sort of, writing, "This north and south and east and west, the chimes of Hyman Dingle." R.H. Patterson in 1854, as the Crimean War commences, refers to a sharp dingling blow. Within 32 years, contemporaneous with the birth of modern field hockey, we find a phrase glossed, "My arm begins to dingle and feel queer." By 1942, Tex Ritter has spurs that dingle, dangle, dingle, and by war's end, Dylan Thomas has placed a knight above the dingle starry, which more or less brings us to today, and to the university's most esteemed Dingler. Colin Dingler is a third-year student in the rhetoric program. I've had the pleasure of knowing him since he was an undergraduate, writing heroically terse poems using the autocomplete function in his cell phone. He has been one of my heroes since then. This year he won not just the Academy of American Poets Prize, but the Rosenberg Lyric Poetry Prize. The judge for the former wrote that his work plays with systems, the fundamental normative systems that would govern who and how we are in the world. Genre, gender, narrative, temporality, grammar, these are among the elements that get reconfigured in the poetry. The result is provocative and beautiful. This seems right to me, if only beginning to nod at Colin's seemingly boundless inventiveness, tossed off with an indifference so delight-filled it can be brutal. The flowers within petals, nanoflowers within odorless patents, he writes. This kind of thing, this materialist nature-culture impasto happens all the time, and then something else happens. Colin Dingler is indeed the something else. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, I owe Joshua thanks for that unusual introduction and, well, educational as well. And also for asking me to read with him today. I'm quite honored. I'm going to read sort of a handful of shorter poems that are more or less new, but some of them are older. Some of them have titles and others don't. And then I'm going to read something that's longer. You could call it a work in progress, but I'm not sure about that. Gyllenhaal remix. We fucked with blood once, or twice. It involved entire peoples, formations of miscellaneous sorts. In the end, the sum was, oh, fuck, we fell so very quickly asleep and left the oil wells burning. When I rustle the papers, you'll know that the poem is done. This doesn't really have a title. The hummingbird in my garden, it is not organic, being a fear suddenly lending me the imperative action of the killing of it in volleys of stones. Under stone repeated, the apparatus twitching unhinges, infinitesimal cameras in classified casings, lends me the certainty of paranoiac daydreams. From fractured chassis, unthread Teflon missive, which reads as follows. The hummingbird in my foxgloves, its perfection being almost unclear, sending me jealously to the edge of a need for my reviewing its architecture of speed. Repeat stone projected, the organism falling in pitches, almost inaudible sibilants from sonorant diction, ending in periods and synapses dumb fire. From wilted body, unwind visceral thread with feather scalpels. I decided today to call this poem Municipality, but we'll see how that goes. Municipality. The travesty was a travesty in that it appeared a fete to which all were invited to negate it. Some visible hand about to pause it changes remotely, gives the lie to the play on the way to verbal roughage. It, myself and I, yes, we're little more than specialists in the ownership of things, apparatchiki of a diorama from which first was subtracted motion, and then all motion, and finally stubborn vestiges of notional porn. The dioramaturges, charged with becoming plastic, in which all artists shrunk, were born in cities called principle. Yes, yes. And that day by the dungeon, we'd rented by the hour. And those days by the dozen, we'd rented by the day. See, some of these are really short, so I feel justified in reading lots of them. Law on forbidden structures. This is just the abstract. In a 46-44 vote, lawmakers in the 101-member assembly approved the law on forbidden structures, which prohibits the public display of monuments that glorify the 5-decade during which forbidden structures occupied the Republic's 101-member assembly. No comment, Sky. And this isn't mine. I actually borrowed this title. A bee went public, made some sweet money. In a shade by the creek, put my lips to my honey. We played at being sleek. On my tongue spilled the sun. All our worries dipped in sleep. Argent clouds metastasize. Number swarms the city's wake. It goes faster than I'm definitely going to be under my 12 to 15 minute time frame here. Well, we can go out earlier, I guess. This is called The Language of Parrots is Fraternal. Word, my word, whose woof is no other's, whose worry is the tumor I shoulder, whose eyes draw vertiginous closer to the edge, whose edge cuts first eyes from olives whose center is a pit. Word whose fingers are molar figures, whose tongue is internal, whose breath breathes sprays into my wind, who ignores me while sleeping. Word in whose time is a necessary threat to my remiss, whose skin is to water as you would is to expect. Word, love, whose prosthesis I am, love, whose sound from other rooms is barely foreign, my love, whom I plan to reproduce indefinitely without permissions, you, love, whose word is my revision. And this is the work in progress. Also without a title, we could call it Das Ding, as a friend of mine suggested earlier. Whatever, I'll take suggestions. Upper managers play at a game of checks and balances all mid-morning over a network created last quarter for other internal purposes. Youth, still dreamy, are everywhere promoted, clutching fast in their hands their salute. As nurses handled babies severed from mothers before that traumatic practice was abolished in a sweeping trauma reform. Flowers within petals, nanoflowers, pressed within odorless patents. Scents without odor until activated by a headword illicit. Novelty's windfall of R&D fuels a plastic upper limit on next quarter's R&D budget. In the continuous drawl of a current, if somewhat warped logic, apothecaries are homophilic, discotheques sociopathic. A lesser parataxist, named Anakila, on her siesta quarter, on a tiny napkin reshapes the overall profit structure after a fresh innovation in her own sector. Widely celebrated, she's credited for uncovering an entire area. She sleeps now in the vaunted luminarium where esteem is focused in our retrospective. No more green sparks now, nor lapis lazuli and orange, nor blood red sparks, nor opaque, nor fawn color sparks, nor derailments of the minute. Fatigue's dumpy curve has a softer, shallower trough. I find my joints echoed everywhere in furniture. Efficiency regards me gaily throughout fixtures in my loft. On one nervous vigil, I determine an angle we live with describes only unredressed oversight. Here you're free to contemplate the historic distance between slab and roof. Oh, it is hateful to me, oh, it is hateful to me, oh, sings the speaker. Waves float relief, in another time alcohol does, in another heat signature. We see in each other more of the aisle we pass in when we see each other on a regular basis. We have gone to work expecting too much, too little, but never with intolerance of the prime. From inside expectations, imminence becomes audible and plural as a wine and wines respectively. Our expectations are nothing save empty promises and not on the bill. From inside work, a wine and wines suggest something sinister beyond the soft-serve machine of our aptitudes. The soft-serve machine melts down. We are always left with almost nothing save a muddle. In the aftermath, I begin anew by writing, "The airport will explode in the airport." In this work, our over-expectation is delineated in a desire to be caught. The correlative is interior architecture, imaged to angled cross-sections of aircraft dissembling duty-free retail. As an objective outsider, they speak such excellent English because their country is so clean, I assume. My life during the room can be divided in half, then in half again, and again, into thirds and so forth. The embedded textiles reflect this in their motif of sinometry, exotic squares. The harmonics twilled into their hollow fibers decompose themselves soothingly towards accidental colors, and a light snapping accompanies the tempo of events entering through the news. An explosion inside of an airport, an inquiry into probes on honesty, an arrest of another historian. I don't recall, alas, any metal tunes or all those flaming cars. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlie Altieri in the English department. I love it when poets make this sort of academic discourse that I'm going to be giving seem stranger than poetry, just because it has no sort of place in relation to. Anyway, Joshua Clover has so many identities that I'm not sure I've kept up with even the public variants. Most of us here know his two books of poetry, Madonna Anno Domini, and then Totality for Kids in 2006. And we may know his intricate small book on the film The Matrix, which I can say is the best Marxist work on film I have ever read, but it's the only Marxist book on film I've ever read, so I can't do justice at all to the intelligence of that book. Clover also reviews books and movies for places like the New York Times and the Village Voice, and he's had a substantial career as a music reviewer, which will come to one culmination in a forthcoming book on aspects of what our popular music tells us about contemporary culture. In addition, he's become somewhat of an expert on architecture and architectural theory, and has been invited to speak at conferences on these topics. Mercifully, my task is only to say a few things about his poetry. And the best way that I can capture the sense of poetry is to talk about an event 2 weeks ago when Tim Clark gave a talk, a terrific talk on Picasso of 1926 to 1932. I want to talk not about that, but about a philosopher who responded to Clark and tried to resurrect the concept of the ugly. It seemed to me that this effort at resurrection missed the fact that the corpse had long since departed. Clark's reading seemed to me to have shown how Picasso had gone immeasurably beyond categories like ugly and beautiful, in part by fusing connections between among the monumental, the monstrous, and the painfully human need to acknowledge forces in cyclic life for which the existing models of painting had no vocabulary. I was reminded of Clover by Clark's talk because, like Picasso, he combines brutal resistance to contemporary pieties with an architectural use of form that establishes a strange and compelling monumentality to spaces virtually uninhabitable except by the imagination. This philosopher's response made me realize just how far Clover is already from sort of the standard aesthetic categories. In the simplest way, ugliness as a value predicate just gives way to possible uses of brutality. And more generally, we're in a position, this put me in a position, to recognize Clover's great achievement of creating authorial positions that, with Picasso-like confidence, establish the power to ignore the basic struggles within modern poetry between stances that pursue sincerity and stances that begin by ironizing the mechanisms of sincerity. I mean, these oppositions really held realm for at least 70 or 80 years, and it's just totally irrelevant to Clover. And that, to me, is the 21st century, which I can't catch up with, actually, but that's the excitement of the possibility. Clover has a strongly lyrical voice, but it does not depend on any psychological disposition towards personal intensities. Rather, voice has the authority of architectural presence. Its basic instrument is the foregrounding of formal relations and oral echoes, combined with an active and aggressive ear for the languages that take on social currency. He places his readers in a strange object world, populated largely by linguistic formulations that have taken on power as commodities. Then he works for some formal way to render the alienating effect of such powers while providing an angle or perspective from which there seems some competing force, some aspect of what might suggest an alternative to commodification. Clover then seeks a political poetry that establishes its authority not by its claims to know, but rather by its capacities to hear what goes awry in the matching of our languages to our presumed needs. Hearing the needs of society can no longer be presented in terms of ideal situations or heroic enterprises, since these are parts of the commodified world. So Clover's work seeks to locate alternative modes of consciousness in the domain of formal intelligence, which provides relational structures with internal vitality not so easily turned into commodities. That's why the drama of his poems consists largely in gathering phenomena into various kinds of sculptural masses that poetry then provides means of mobility. These sculptural formal masses allow Clover to turn an Ashberean idea for used in usurious language away from Ashbery's own ironically patheticized bourgeois distance. Clover's is a poetics of no exit from the commodified. There is only the brutal effort to struggle against how the dominant forces in society idealize language use. This means that eloquence itself becomes something other than Stevensian, other than mining the rhetorical capacities of inherited syntactic and semantic resources. Eloquence becomes primarily structural, a matter of gaining weight and substance by intricate echoes among large syntactic and oral forces put to work within the poem. Bob Haas once taught me how to read Stevens for the weight of his phrasing. I think Clover demands a new model of rhetorical weight and substance, and that's a significant measure of his relevance for the Stevensian idea of a contemporary poet. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Joshua, well, probably for the third and last time, because I'm going to renounce. I've said everything I have to say.
I'm already thinking of possible strategies to live up to that. Reciting 3 hours of what was on television last night seems like one possibility, but I'm not ready for that. Thanks, Charlie, for that, and thanks for inviting me here. Thanks, Colin, for reading. All possible remaining thanks. This is basically a reading about train stations. And it's going to come in 3 parts. I'm going to start with some odds and ends, and then I'm going to read 5 poems from the recent book, and then end with a set of 5 new poems. But I'm actually going to start the odds and ends with a poem by someone else. This is called Parade of the Old New by Brecht. I stood on a hill and I saw the old approaching, but it came as the new. It hobbled up on new crutches, which no one had ever seen before, and stank of new smells of decay, which no one had ever smelt. The stone that rolled past was the newest invention, and the screams of the gorillas drumming on their chests set up to be the newest thing in music. Everywhere you could see open graves standing empty as the new advanced on the Capitol. Round about stood those who inspired terror, shouting, "Here comes the new, it's all new. Salute the new, be new like us." And those who heard nothing but their shouts, and those who saw certain people who were not shouting. So the old strode in disguised as the new, but it brought the new with it in its triumphal procession and presented it as the old. The new went fettered and in rags. They revealed its splendid limbs, and the procession moved through the night, But what they thought was the light of dawn was the light of fires in the sky. And the cry, "Here comes the new, it's all new, salute the new, be new like us," would have been easier to hear if everything had not been drowned in the thunder of guns. I recently co-wrote a series of 12 poems with my friend and many of your colleagues, Chris Nealon, called Berlin's Second Childhood. Some of the poems he wrote, some of the poems I wrote, some of the poems we wrote together. This is the poem numbered 4. Of the hailing and hoisted voice, the when and how, only the grain remains. One among the surfaces resisting touch, keener yes and no, of a certain frequency, high behind the barricades and modulating without mercy into speculation where fury, human fury, presents itself without fear of punishment, oh mistaken, hopelessly specialized into a set of habits you believed were universal, and you found yourself high behind the barricades, blood beating in your ears, no sound like the sound of negative epiphany, smashed monastic flowering less intricately against the state's intricate flower, its adamantine baroque, sprung from the hive of likeness. Your hand gets stuck in, incommensurate, but not misguided. This architecture should have been monumentality gone mad. But it's built around a nimbus of tags and icons, aphanal signs for order and chaos, mute, porous, flaky. It formed a ring at the core of things, like a snow flurry in a glass left sloshing on the bar when just that song comes on and we go. The last time I read it at a UC school was at Santa Cruz. It was last fall. And it was a lovely reading, and it rained during the reading. It turns out, anyone go to Santa Cruz undergraduate by any chance here? So I can tell you about this. It turns out there's this tradition that the first rain of the year, all the denizens of, I don't know, some of the colleges they have there, are required by tradition to race around the campus in a circle naked. So when I walked out of the reading, I was presented by a line of 300 naked running people. This has nothing to do with this poem. I was just remembering that. This poem is actually a draft, and I don't easily read drafts, but I actually lured some people here with a promise I was going to read a confessional poem. And not only that, but one written specially for the occasion. And needless to say, I didn't finish it in time, so I will read the version to be changed radically later. If I had slightly more dignity, I would ask you to turn off the camera, but I've made my avowal. It's called Return to Work at the Wonder Factory, which is the name of a movie that's about 5 minutes long, made in 1968. Oh, opulent spring, just a week away. Oh, local details so favored by poets, and glowing abstractions beyond the global curve, also revered by poets, and the itch to make an account of it all. I want to be able to tell the story of my century and how it ended. Of my century from Dada to Prada. Of my friends and brawls and the Asian flu and long-term capital management. Of books, and you know whose beautiful language. Works in days, kid, works in days. Of life in cities where we finally became organic and kept going. Of the architects who like to invent new names for the situations, like bubble cities and Zoom burbs. There is no shortage of names. But basically there have been 3 kinds of cities: labyrinth, grid, sprawl. 4 if you count the network. They can be found in history, where the girls are. It keeps ending, but for July 4th, backyard party ongoing chez toi. Democracy is so suburban. It was raining in Das Kapital. I went to university and all I learned was Molotov 101. The Thai bot glows briefly, and then the ruble, which has been everywhere and once rubbed shoulders with Mayakovsky. But I say there is nothing as beautiful as the yuan, and among all the various bills with their lotuses and their halls of the people, none compares to the humble kwai note with its orchid watermark and 3 pools mirroring the moon at West Lake. It's a wonder the poem is still in business. I know this poem is too much like Juliana. I know this poem is too much like America. I know this poem is too much like my last poem. If it wasn't for bad faith, I wouldn't have any faith at all. Dante mentions the tears of things, and can't we just get over it and start calling the simultaneous subject-object of history the subject? Somewhere in there, Brazil devalues the real, and then Jean Baudrillard dies. Opulent spring only 2 weeks away. What were once facts are now feelings. Is this what you mean, manifesto? What were once facts are now feelings. And is this what you mean, the swan? All that is Rimbaud melts into air. And is this what you meant, century? It was hard not to start every poem, so Frank and Vladimir and the sun walk into a bar. It was hard not to start every poem. It was raining in Das Kapital. It was hard not to end every poem. The donors looked indulgently on. Oh, opulent spring, less than a week away. Winter is the most hopeful of seasons. A utopia is a thoroughly modern emotion. One has drunk quite a many of texts, and now wishes of everything to sing. Contempt. This illuminated surface of events, this present tense, this staring at screens we have been doing to escape the flatness of these deadpan days, this calling movies dreams, this calling memories Rome. The colors in contempt come from a world with more minutes in each hour. But a real world, a world almost remembered in this long celebration of a cult without dreams and without mercy. Oh, record stores and union halls. Oh, leaded glass nostalgia for an artisanal form of this catastrophe. Oh, recollected thickness of that one newspaper Franco calls the daily of my life. Oh, Le Chine de Jack Palance. Oh, world where Coca-Cola has not lost its true flavor. Right before the reading, I was over at the Free Speech Cafe, picking out poems. And I saw the little sign posted in the entrance saying that the cafe was in honor of Mario Savio, and it says, whose passion, moral clarity, and democratic style of leadership inspired thousands of fellow Berkeley students. Which is weird, because I kind of think it was the fact that he was right. Poem. We always send it to the wrong address. And now that buoys even our most impersonal days. Everyone is beautiful. And then, almost everyone. C'est cool, the shift that enchants the world, or at least the afternoon of the world, before it's off to meet Chris and all at glimmering Colleen's, arriving Southside early and so 20 minutes for Lynn's The Fatalist, amidst the super lit video store on the corner. It's funnier in French, super lit. But not much else is. One is haunted by the suspicion that one is in a society composed of people one will never meet. For example, the society that thinks about someone named Annalise occasionally. So I walk back around and up the stairs, and Chris puts on Either Or. Elliott Smith, 20th Century American, is nonetheless a star in the constellation Our Romanticism. We've been hanging out a lot there recently. A keener melancholy about the music for a week or two afterward may be obvious, but something has to be done with the excess flowering inside death, or is it just apotropaic? We'll see. The most awful thing about the phrase, every germinal must have its thermidor, is that one never gets to say so anymore and really mean it. We lie down in categories and wake up in concepts, But must there be so much of the day spent tracking stray remarks in others' hearts and maintaining a casual balance between OxyContin and poetic prose so new sensations emerge? Meanwhile, but I am happy to see you, it's enough, but not of anything. This poem's called An Archive of Confessions, a genealogy of confessions. Charlie requested it because he wanted to hear how the rhymes worked. I suspect he was making fun of me, but one gets used to it. An Archive of Confessions, a genealogy of confessions. Now the summer air exerts its syrupy drag on the half-dark city under the strict surveillance of quotation marks. The citizens, with their cockades and free will, drift off from the magnet of work to the terrible magnet of love. In the far suburbs, crenellated of Cartesian yards and gin, the tribe of mothers calls the tribe of children in across the bluing evening. It's the hour things get to be excellently pointless, like describing the alphabet. Yikes. It's fine to be here with you, watching the great events without taking part, clinking our ice as they advance, yet remain distant. Like the baker always about to understand, idly sweeping up that he is the recurrence of Napoleon in a baker's life, always interrupted by the familiar notes of a childish song, no more sleepy dreaming. We float casually on the surface of the day, staring at the bottom, jotting in our daybooks how beautiful the armies of autumn. When I was completing this book, it's published by UC Press. They sent me that packet that they send, I assume, to all authors, where you list your name and your address and whether you're willing to take part in newspaper interviews, always a tremendous threat for poets, and various bits of sort of standard aggregation of information. It's the same thing. It goes to people who've written histories and cookbooks, and then there was the part about the index and whether or not you'd be preparing it yourself or having them do it. So I said I'd be preparing it myself, and hired a friend of mine, a great poet named Andrew Joran, who's also, in his spare time, a copy editor and indexer, to make an index for the book, from which I will now read. I think I'll read T through V. I won't read the page numbers. That might ruin the surprise. Tears for Fears. Turk, Sonia. Thermidor. Tininess. See also monumentality. Towers. Trains. Ugliness. University of California at Berkeley. Urbanism. Utopia. Vale of Lang, Valiant, Prince. Van Eyck, Raoul, Vertigo, Vertov, Jiga, Violence. This is called For the Little Soldier. So, it turns out I'm totally a Knight Templar. At loose ends, now that the Crusades are discredited and the banking industry is controlled by lawyers, which, like New Yorkers, is really just a code for Jews. Now I like to read magazines called things like Telestar and Shock, and post to my blog in what teen people calls the latest in mediated indifference. Sometimes I like to compose little poems and imagine you reading them. I like to pretend you're a real person, dressed in a suit, selling copies of Mao's Little Red Book on Sproul Plaza, and declaiming your favorite passages at lunchtime. You do not know a town until you know where the drunkards go to piss. Until you know the daydreams occupying the woman on the assembly line, you do not know the country. Of course, there are many systems to put those dreams there inside her amphitheatrical skull, operated by people known as affect workers, like you, and me, and Drew Barrymore. We help people feel certain ways and are paid a living wage, plus the little bit extra called the hook or the sting, a small but pleasant feeling like a tiny holographic version of meeting the president. The imagination resembles nothing so much as a salon for special expositions and a museum closed because it's the 1st of May. In this way, it can be distinguished from politics, history's Colosseum, where the great powers set the lesser at each other's throats. I'm going to read one more from the book. It's a longer poem. It's in 4 parts. They're unnumbered. It's called At the Atelier Theology. It requires me to do a bad, fake Russian accent. This is okay. It would be tragic if I had to do a good fake Russian accent, since that would surely not work out for us. But I'll see if I can handle the brief passage here. At the Atelier Theology. The sun tutoyes me, adrift beyond heroic realism in the postmodern sublime, where every window can lie like a priest, adrift in the utopia for bourgeois kittens having of late learned the trick of how to listen to 2 songs at once. Double your measure, double your fun. It seems to defy death, and still the commodity is not cast down. I say Frank O'Hara was an anarchist. Nothing else explains all that joy. Exclamation point. He was not a systems guy. At the end of Beckett's version of Zone, the new century rips the head off the old and calls it the sun, and that's joy too. The anarchic sun leaping out of a fin de siècle type of sparagma so it can make with a rendezvous a century later and greet me all casual, as if we were old friends. Where did you get those shoes? How's Rotifer doing? Who's sleeping in their warehouse studio? And oh, by the way, Joshua, why are you so obsessed with the modern and its endnotes? What about going to bed in the sensuous now and here, you know, the sublime sublime? These are all good questions, which explains how you got to be the sun. And I know it's not an easy job, knowing everything half the time or half of things all the time, melting everybody's cacao whiskey, being called names by poets and other tasks and tribulations, this world, this half-read hebdomad, this jackery of knickknacks, all in day's work, Sun says, adopting a comical Bolshevik accent. But please, tell those boys to stop writing poems for Lily Brick. It doesn't get any more homosocial than that. So, I am wondering if the sun is the last Soviet, the self-sustaining factory of the sun, but just as I begin to wonder into the old haunts under the scarlet letter H, the cold afternoons of Vitebsk and the Jigovertov, I recall my new friend and shout over my shoulder, thanks for the advice. Anytime. After all, it's free. Say hello to the generation that burned itself in effigy. It turns out everything is the world in miniature, and this was not good news. In the magazine racks, in the downtowns, in the video arcades, while the band danced in a cafe in 2 suits and a dress, I turned 21 in parole, doing prison without life. It is a beautiful night. We live in the world of the anti-lyric and the train that bears money into the city, where it is at its happy-go-luckiest after a season socked away in the cabinet of a country house bordered on all sides by the austere cinematic light of mid-century. When the money arrived, it leapt the canals gracefully, sometimes in the skins of men, and sometimes leaping more abstractly through the city, between bare consciousness and the bourse of basic beliefs, or as the pocket philosophes often say, everything is connected. An idea that casts the Janus shadows of paranoia and mysticism, and still is not mistaken. We could not understand until we had been there in the long hallways, in the passages, in the upstairs windows, low under the glass roofs. We survive in the speech of what voices? We, the alphabet present in a purely spoken language. Ah, America, you have got worn thin. Plus, unable to hold Americans. In the morning, citizens loiter on the little bridge beneath the latest billboards, talking on mobile phones in popular modern languages and the jargon of birds. All the futurists are in the past. giving the sense history really has ended, sometime around El Lissitzky. In the evening, one is always coming upon some square where meaning has already congealed amidst architecture students and beer. You love one of them from a shy distance, as melancholy Albania loves indifferent France. It seems more important to have a theory of writing based on Giorgio the painter de Chirico, lest a leisurely debate on dreams brawl into the street and occupy our attentions until it's time to sleep. There is no pleasure like wasting time in your city, divided into quarters, sisters, and zones beneath the clattering gears of the moon and the sun, oh, most industrial and beguiling of lullabies, heard at the wedding of Sonia Turk and Robert Delaunay. It is a beautiful night. We live in the world of the anti-lyric that is still sung in the city's dominated sectors. The blue bar is closing, and the orange bar is closed. I wonder how friends are while walking home. Sleeping and dreaming are dialectical, dear. I have a fragment in my head, Apollinaire. You go to the black suburb, et in Arcadia ego. Past a rival street, you is ambiguous. Many things are music, of which some, 6 or 7 words struck out and illegible. For me, as he was to almost all the younger ones, a stranger, et in Arcadia ego, the art of the present comes down to 4 discrepant images of BB turning toward us, toward our shared machine eye, our deep disfluency. Out past a rival street, we go to the black suburbs, we are buried in Grant's tomb, et in Arcadia ego, we walk in the garden of his turbulence, et in Arcadia ego, we are in a station of the metro, we are lost in the editing of July, we too lived in arcades you will find us. All right, this is a set of 5 poems. I'm temporarily calling this group World System Affect. The first one is called Poem. Stop it with your strategies. The longest social experiment in history has been abandoned. Nobody liked it anyway. The cigarettes were awful. Now we live in cities where daily life is so sensual one retreats into abstraction. Dirty canals, cars on fire, autumn. Under the glass and iron of the train station bar, the train station pigeons fly into your hair. You listen to a song no one will remember in 30 months. No one but this poem. This decay of the little event that happens at the point of purchase. People are departing or arriving. It's impossible to tell by looking, like the duck rabbit that so amused the 20th century philosophers. The mind as we know it was developed in winter gardens, panoramas, factories, wax museums, casinos, and train stations. Oh, architecture, you are the greatest art. Your content is modernity. I am an incarnation of time. I do not own my own weapons. When I go to the movies to cure my boredom, I do not wish to see boredom represented. Take that, French filmmakers. You've taken everything else. The pop years is over. Here comes China. Memories of Bergen op Zoom. What if there wasn't another way? But this one turned out to be different enough. The film ran at different speeds in different places in the world system, and here they wore Margiela, and here they invented ballet funk. The grinding of zones against zones gave forth a gout of sparks we called spirit, and it sometimes appeared to come to rest inside mute things, like poems, but this was a famous illusion. We spent years unraveling it to get at the tatterdemalion behind the words. Did you hear the one about the stripper who read Capital and misunderstood the part about the table dancing? Some went not to the factory of dreams, but the dream of factories. Things have been getting pretty valedictory in here. Leaving the 20th sentence was taking longer than expected, with the train clacking along in its sprockets, and you could still see the departure station waving in evening. Another night on the Brecht Bardot, waiting for the reversal that would set it all on its feet again. Not the history of violence, but the violence of history. The poets are reading Machiavelli when they should be reading Clausewitz. the red posters. We had been in the world for a while, and two men stood on opposite platforms conversing loudly in a language while they waited for their trains. And these were our trains too. We shared the trains as we shared the news. We followed the image trails down to our image defeats, and we shared these too. There was always some defeat or the occasional image victory on television or the covers of the dailies, a lib and a trib. This was our daily regime, and trains and language and money were the main ways of moving things into distance and time. Oh, our century that we lived in like a city. We'd been in the world for a while, image wounded, image lit. We talked across the tracks. We had reasons for staying. We were hunched in the metro within the great circulation. Red posters hung on the walls. They seemed to announce further defeats in cryptic terms. The main feeling on the platform was hardly a feeling at all. The sensation of the circuits routing through us. It was the way of being in the world we had been offered, and not being able to name it was part of this. When we hung posters, they were world posters. The images hurt or betrayed us, and we did the same to them. Finally, we lived together in the image world. A train came. The conductor leapt off the front car as another leapt on to replace her. And the first conductor swung her bag of street clothes as she climbed the stairs out of the station. The beauty of this was our beauty too. It was world beauty. The men stood on platforms that were world platforms, and though they appeared poor, they lived here with us in a world city. We were world men and world women. The trains were world trains. When we spent money, it leapt right into the circuits, whoosh. We saw right away that it had been in our care, but it didn't belong to us. It was world money. This is called Omnibus Omnia. Which was written over the entrance to what some argue was the first mall ever finished in 1846 in Belgium. It means everything for everyone, quite reasonably enough. It's always a good day for Apollinaire, and September 2, and the public market's thatched awning barely remembers it was once an arcade, and I am in love with Green Gartside, who is the most enigmatic pop star until the next one. This is the replacement you get offered for your childhood. Gone now, those golden summers goofing off in Bretton Woods. But no time for melancholy when the California sun is emptying its bank account and the sidewalks are full of citizens bemusedly lining up to be alive. And later there's a Zhang Zhu movie playing down at the Panorama that wasn't there yesterday. A small change. But could this be the crisis we hoped for? Or just a cyclical correction, like the rise and fall of hemlines? A new prince should make everything new, as old Ezra found within a Florentine discourse written in the same decade as Utopia, that he later condensed down to 3 small words which spread like a stain across the long 20th century. But that can be our little secret, and a lesson in humility for the new Confucians. Culture happens everywhere at once, or not at all, and we belong to it. In France, the France you see on television, the latest styles are on the march down the Faubourg Saint-Honoré to the guillotine around the corner. They will walk again, though no one's saying that's a theory of history or anything. But where are the skinny black suits of yesteryear? Oh, they're back for a few minutes in the fall, and Apollinaire is walking around again, and Villon is riding around like Karina Lau, who is riding around again in the punctual train from the future that still hasn't arrived, and the sans-culottes and Scritti Politti are walking around again, but we are walking around for the first time. Me and you, before these wonders for the first time, and Stephanie and May saying hello inside the system of objects also for the first time. Having been born and still utopian, we race off for the revolutions of the Mark Jacobins. I've been busy retitling this last poem all day. I'd thought to call it Twilight of the Young Hegelians. I'd thought to call it The Love Song of Robert Bergoneau. I'm going to stick with the original title, which is Poem. But I will dedicate it to the EBI. Oh, capital, let's kiss and make up. And I'll take back all those terrible things I said about you to my friends and in poems. What do poets know of capital anyway? It's exhilarating, the daily life of money, as it shifts and deliberates like Frank O'Hara buying gifts in a haze of cosmopolite third-worldism en route to a weekend out of town. Yet so affectless, this becomes itself a signature affect. Via the artifice of the Dow Jones, you often appear to be in New York. But I suspect that if consciousness is a story, you are more like narrative structure. And so the NASDAQ and the FTSE and the Nikkei index cannot be said to happen any more than the sentence happens. Is that a feeling? Like true feelings, you're everywhere at once. That's Neoplatonism for you, or simple immanence, but either way the road leads to St. Augustine, and don't get me started. Nice city, good job. It must be hard to hold the things of the world in an order while studiously skirting the question of whether you are a thing yourself. And I can imagine the anxiety this causes, but capital, don't you ever lie on the couch, near the coffee in the late morning, reading for the second, third time one of the magazines you picked up in one of your supermarkets in California, until you come to the photo of Britney Spears in flip-flops and drag, you know, sort of like Googling yourself? Could poets ever hate idealism as much as you do? No ideas but in money. Thus your sweetness, the portability and persistence of ideas that have given us so much pleasure, and move as pleasure must move through the gold integument of this life. Oh, to be forms content, capital. On behalf of myself and all my friends, I want to apologize for, 1917. And hope we can put that behind us and do whatever it takes to feel joined to everyone else in this town and distant cities, and every person in the system that is at this time and in this space of flows the world. Thanks very much. I stay here?
Yeah,
I stay here. Hi, thanks for coming. And staying.
So we'll take some questions. Okay.
Yes, sir.
What does your shirt say?
That's of no matter, but thanks for asking.
The concept of the hardening conflict with itself, can you tell us what this has to do with your work?
Where does that concept come from?
William Faulkner's second speech on the Nobel Prize.
The fact that I'm unable to answer that question is almost a guarantee that I will never win a Nobel Prize. Is that correct? I think that I'm sure people have hearts in conflict with themselves. I don't believe that's the fundamental conflict in the world that interests me. So I'll leave that to people who think that's the drama for them. The question was, when do I know or feel that the poem is done or complete? After you applaud. That's a good question. I mean, I work on poems very slowly. Between these two books was eight years. So one of the answers may be I'm not very good at knowing at all, and eventually one just gives up and says done or not done arbitrarily. But I very rarely rewrite after I think it's finished. That is to say, I write very, very slowly and don't know where it ends, and when I write what I think is the ending, then I say it's done. And if I get to the ending, it's done. If I don't get to the ending, I give up on it after a couple of years. But, Pollock has all the good answers to these questions. And I can mostly leave them to him, I mean, the obvious Pollock to quote would be his answer to the question of how do you know painting's done, but that's not the important one. The important one is when he staggers out of the studio, not wondering whether the painting is good or bad, but whether it's a painting at all. At some point it's a poem, then it doesn't matter if it's done or not. Way back there.
So, why do you title so many poems?
Because I don't know when a title's done. I certainly didn't used to, but I'm not particularly proud of my titles. So when in doubt, I go the Frank O'Hara route, which is just to call it poem and let the first line be I always mean the first lines or I'd take them out. So that's what shows up in the table of contents. It's not a good title, poem? If you rearrange it, it spells mope.
How do you feel about, I mean, you make a lot of allusions to, like, I don't know, pop culture people, for example, like when you're talking about Britney Spears, and, I mean, figures like that tend to evolve a lot. I mean, Britney Spears, totally different implication than, like, 20 minutes ago, probably by now. Like, how do you feel like your poems are going to change? Like, do you get scared that people are going to be like, why, like, not understanding the implications since pop stars, like, by nature, just chasing their people? You know what I mean?
That's a classic question. And like there's several components for me. One is like, yeah, the Britney Spears thing is crazy. Like as I was reading that, like I had in my mind that picture of her I'd seen, whether it was in a magazine or online, I don't know, of like walking around in flip-flops. And I was like, shit, no one remembers that. People remember bald Britney now. Like that's but at the same time, like who the hell wants to be universal and have lasting infinite meaning? That's just the worst fate I could imagine. You know, people always say in writing workshops, which I periodically teach, I think this happens especially in fiction workshops, which I don't teach, but I hear tell of, you know, like, well, you shouldn't put, you know, a Prius in your story because then it'll be dated. You know, it's like don't put a light bulb in your story. Like now it's dated. So it doesn't seem like a legitimate concern to me. If poetics, the term in general, has any meaning, it's attempting to find a form that's adequate to its historical moment, not to someone else's historical moment. Then two at once. I'll stall Rob. He's not from here.
Along those lines, I was going to ask you about the relationship between your music writing and your poetry. Does one inform the other, or do they seem like separate activities to you?
Less and less. I mean, if I can expand music writing out to critical writing in general, because I do less music writing now than I used to in more movies and literary reviews and scholarly essays. And they used to not. I used to summarize legal documents for a living, and I was incredibly insistent. I lived in one room, and I had two desks. One desk with a PC where I worked on legal documents, and one desk with a Mac where I worked on poems. And I was incredibly sort of scrupulous about not letting them interfere with each other. And that's actually become less and less the case. So, for example, the last 5 poems I read are, for me, a different kind of summary of a paper I gave at Stanford about contemporary art and what I call world system affect a couple months ago. And it turns out I'm no longer able to work on multiple problems at once, in short. So I tend to have a problem that fascinates me, and I'm working on it here, and I'm working on it there, and it keeps showing up. So it's not like one informs the other. It's like whatever the problem is for me, it informs both of them at once in somewhat different ways. And editors, for one, tell you what you can and can't say. And that may be disastrous for the poems. The main thing editors say is you can't use the word dialectical. And so that tends to creep in, except for Rob. And that tends to creep into, so those words that get rejected over there tend to seep up over here. I wonder about the long-term effects of that, but I'll find out.
I'm going to try to say something about Colin as well. World system affect. I presume there isn't a hyphen between the first two.
I don't know, because it's in my head it's really in German. It's completely like fake Weltsystem affect, and it's all one word. So, but you can put a hyphen in if you want.
But the third word, those three, I heard the lost taste of Coca-Cola, and I heard apotropaic, and I heard in the last long poem of yours, among the complex, quite inaccessible words, the word alas, very near to the word I, and I wonder about the antec there, especially in this distinction between sincerity and irony. I heard lamentation. Is it there?
I don't have a good answer. Go.
What are you talking about? I mean, you had like at least 3 of those references, and I was only the last, which was a quotation anyway. So
I already
I'm
stood
just
there
kidding.
and quoted Pollock. Go.
So repackage it so that I can so it's more about my poem, and then I'll. What was the question again? I mean, about whether or not there's affect, like a sense of remorse, or.
I was kind of responding, I suppose. I heard that there was a lot about, well, world system, okay, fair enough. The sculptural formal masses. I suppose I'm just wondering about individuality and emotion. I didn't realize the alas was a quote. That in itself just seems.
No, I was actually just joking about that.
Yeah, so world system, fine. We tick those boxes, especially in Charles Altieri's introduction. What about affect?
Yeah, I think that there should be quite a sort of. I think that should be sort of dripping with affect. Yeah, I was aware that it's sort of an overwrought move to use alas and basically the ultimate line of the poem, but what was the word that you used? It wasn't remorse. Lamentation.
I thought it was lovely.
Yeah. No. I mean, I'm not. I think that it might come off like my poems sometimes are just hyper ironic when I use a word like alas, but that's not my intention at all, for what that's worth. Yeah. So I don't know. I can't answer that any better.
I mean, Colin tried to answer that question honestly, but I can honestly dodge it. When I say I'm not talking about a specific phenomenon I'm interested in, which is that personal poems, the space of the personal or the I that you're sort of interested in, the main thing they can't do, I think, is feel their way through the main thing we do with our lives every day, which is to say the main thing we do all day long is act as these nodes through which capital and information pass, using us as nodes to get from one place to another and picking up momentum on the way. And that's our participation in the world system, right? That's the fundamental activity we do, and we don't experience it. It has no affect, or we have no affect of it. So that's the world system affect I'm trying to make an account of, and I find I can't get there coming out of a sort of an I poem in the way that it's most traditionally constructed to get at that affect or that missing affect, and so I get interested in talking in other ways to try and capture that loss, that lost affect of what we're dragooned into concern, and often with our own delight, participating in all day long. And that's the affect I mean. There's plenty of other affects too, but Seamus Heaney has them covered.
I have a two-part question. Don't really know how to say it. Is there something about the postmodern world that negates the idea of a concrete place or setting, its function within a poem or just in the world in general, and kind of replaces it with this ether, this abstract ether? And also, how do you define postmodern?
Tim? I'll certainly try and answer the first one, which is that it's certainly not that simple. That there used to be places, and now we live in the grand floating network without a place. It does seem to me it brings forward the drama between those two things. Like there's two forms of vernacular in the world I live in. I don't want to make any claims for places in the United States, much less places in other countries that I don't have a lot of firsthand experience with. But in the two worlds, there's there's local vernacular, the way that people talk in Oaktown, and the way that people talk in Vallejo, and the way that people talk in Davis and in Los Angeles and in Boston. So there's all these vernaculars tied to place, and there's vernaculars that are basically tied to work, which is to say they're pretty mobile, because work is, for at least one class, increasingly mobile. If not flying around the world, certainly telecommuting and not identically all going to the same office at the same time. So there's this vernacular that comes out of an increasing mobility of labor, and a vernacular that still remains rooted in place. And those two things have a drama between them. Those two pressures on on what language we have and how that language lets us think. And I'm interested in the pressure between those two things, and that does seem the balance of the two things has shifted, and that seems to me a meaningful fact about late modernity. I don't have a good story to tell about postmodernism, but David Harvey does. So you should read his book. Condition. I have it blanked in my head. Condition of Postmodernity. Is that right? Yeah, Condition of Postmodernity by David Harvey. Or Fred Jameson's good too.
Is that all?